Good morning, and welcome to part 11 of our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, if you've been following this along, you'll realize that Solomon has had a relationship with God in his earlier life, but has sort of lost that due to his involvement with paganism and with pagan idols and pagan philosophers. But he still does not disbelieve in God. So he has shown us in the first two chapters how meaningless life seems to be if there's no God in the picture. How everything we do ends up really in either someone else's hands or going to naught. It's the fact that we all die, we all go back to dust. So he believes that in all that he's done, all his achievements, all his accomplishments, all that he's obtained, it's really meaningless in the long run for him. So then in chapter 3, he's gone on to say, well, there really must be a God because of the order of the fact that there's a time for everything and the fact that there is an order to the world. But then he goes on to talk about the problems with what God seems to do. Does God not have the power to change the way things are, or does he not have the compassion to change the way things are? He talks about the injustice that's in the world. He talks about the persecutions that's in the world. He talks about the work that people do primarily for naught and for the envy of others, or how the envy of others tends to be aggravated because of the success of someone else. And in chapter 4 he says, God tests people that they may see themselves are like animals in what they try to do and what they try to accomplish. But at the same time, like animals, we all die. And in the end, we all end up in the same place and in the same position. But he says there must be a God, even though we don't understand his purposes and his programs. So that we should actually just really enjoy what God has given us, rather than trying to strive for something extraordinary. But he says in all of this, there's a perplexity, because we should go back now to the church, but even the church has its own difficulties. So we start chapter 5, when he says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. What he's saying is, go to church. In his case, go to the temple. But go to the place of worship. But do it cautiously and do it with respect and with prudence. It's your attitude that makes the difference. Go with a good attitude. Go with listening, and go with the ability to listen and to try to understand. So walk prudently, walk with a good attitude, walk carefully, because you're in a house that's holy, in a place that is holy. So walk with prudence. Just be careful how you behave and conduct yourself inside the house of worship. And also listen. You're there to listen, to learn, to understand, and not to talk, not to give the sacrifice of fools. We are supposed to give what's called a sacrifice of praise in a house of God. And that may be in worship, it may be in music, it may be by listening, it may be in conversation, it may be by discussion. But there may be many ways in which you can give a sacrifice to God which is honest. But don't give a sacrifice of fools, which means that you say one thing and believe another, or that you do things and think about something while you're actually giving praise. Do it honestly and diligently and earnestly if you're going to give it at all. At the time of Solomon, there used to be people who would go to the sacrifice and take animals that were maimed or muted, or were somehow not the best. This is what God has said is not acceptable. This is why you had to have unblemished animals for the sacrifice in Jewish times. So you must have unblemished praise, unblemished thoughts, unblemished worship when you're actually trying to worship God in His house. If not, it becomes a sacrifice of fools, even though people don't understand that they're doing something which is not right. So, he says in verse 2, "Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you in earth, therefore let your words be few." It's much more important to have a few honest, sincere, heartfelt words than to ramble on about a lot of things with which you are not sincere or not truly honest. You must go to God with an honest heart. It says in the Bible you must worship Him in spirit and in truth. And if this is not done, then the worship becomes false and it is not acceptable. God has said a number of times that we are to worship Him only in spirit and in truth, and not with this theory of anger, because many people are angry at God for what they perceive or think that He is doing. All the troubles in the world they blame on God, and they go to church or they go to a place of worship or they go to their prayers and they're angry. Now, what it really means is that we are to walk carefully, walk prudently, walk carefully, and listen. Do not be rash with our mouth in worship or in our thoughts. What we are supposed to do is give the burden to God and not the blame. So the question is, do we honor Him and do we trust Him? Some people are so angry with God that it affects their life in many ways. A social psychologist, Judy Eileen, found a direct link between anger at God and anxiety and depression, written in the Journal of Health Psychology number 3, 1999. This is probably quite obvious if you think about it, because the more anger you have, the more apt to be anxious or depressed you become. So, when we have problems, when we have troubles, when we have questions, we often become angry with God for the injustice, for the persecution, for the type of social structures that we see. But instead, we should not do that. We should not become angry. It's okay to question. It's okay to ask, but not to become angry. People have lost many things because of what they perceive to be God's indifference or God's absence. You often hear in a car accident or after a fire, after some kind of natural disaster, where was God in all this? And people become angry at God, rather than understanding that much of the blame for these things rests with us, not with God. Job was a person who walked with God very, very sincerely and very, very accurately. But as you know from the book of Job, he lost everything. He lost his family, he lost his home, he lost his livestock, he lost his dwellings, and he actually lost much of his own health. His wife actually asked him to curse God and die, but he did not. He questioned God, he talked to God, but he never cursed him. And as a result, in the end, all of his belongings and all of his wealth was restored to him. Horatio Spafford was a person in modern times who again was a religious man and a wealthy man, but he lost everything in the Chicago fire. He lost his home, he lost his business, he lost his fortune. And sending his family overseas by boat to escape the problems that he had in Chicago, the boat sank and he lost his 4 daughters. He again could have cursed God, but he didn't. He ended up, as a result, writing a famous hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." He also went on to Egypt, founded missionaries and orphanages there, and in much of his life restored to him. The idea is, when we become angry with God, do we go into a house to worship Him in sincerity and in truth, or do we go in as an angry mind with an angry attitude and a blaming attitude towards God? This is what it says: do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily. Think what you're going to say. Think what it means. Think what is being done. Consider everything. Consider it so that your heart is in the right condition, the right perspective before God in the house of worship. He says in verse 3 that a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. Many people are so active and so involved with secular activities that they develop dreams. They dream about these or have nightmares about them. And sometimes they interpret this as something coming from God. It's a matter of letting your mind rest. Not letting your mind be too active. Not letting your mind be too concerned. So that you don't have false dreams and false visions. And also that you don't say too much too hastily. Because it says very much that too much words is not good. There are people who put it much more succinctly. It says that too many words is like a blabbermouth. All you do is talk without thinking. So it's important to be in a form of sincerity and with the right attitude if you're into a church. Not to blame God. Put your burdens on Him, but not to blame. So the thing is, one, to walk prudently, walk carefully, consider your attitude and your affect. And the second is to worship and pray honestly, earnestly. Few words, but sincerely. This is really what it means, because there's so much falsehood in some of the places of worship. Then he goes on to part 3. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. In other words, we make rash promises. We say things that we really don't mean. And we say pledges that we really have no means to keep. But this is not something we should do hastily or without forethought. Because what it really does is, when you make a vow, you actually involve God in it. This is why God in Matthew 3, and Matthew 5, stated this: Again you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So what he is saying here is to make your word true, and not necessarily swear and make a vow. Because once you swear and make a vow, you actually are vowing something before God. So the idea is not to do this, because if you do and don't keep it, then you are in essence cheating God or mocking Him. In Galatians 6 verse 7, it says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. So one must be careful making vows, even simple vows that seem innocuous to us, but in fact, if they are a vow, if you swear, especially by God, you're going to do something, then you are actually involving God into it, and He does not take it lightly. We sometimes are very cavalier in our attitudes as to how we do things and how we react. But what Solomon is saying here is that even in these churches, these cavalier attitudes, these cavalier actions have a meaning and have a detriment and do not go unnoticed. God has a seriousness to Him. He is to be worshipped, He is to be reverent, He is to be considered holy, and He is to be treated as such. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy yourself in church. It doesn't mean you can't have good music. It can't mean you can't laugh and you can't have fun, but you must do it in a sincere way towards Him and towards each other, and not in a mocking and not in an angry way, and not do something behind someone's back or do something in your thoughts that is not evident in your actions. This is what he is saying, because even in places of worship, there is this falsehood. There is this superficial worship which is not really true. And God would have not, apparently, does not want anything which is not sincere or in spirit and in truth. For many people make false promises and false vows and never really consider actually keeping them. And maybe simple things, I'll meet you, by God I'll be there, and I swear to God I'll be there at a certain time, and you have no intention of keeping it. That is a false vow which may have consequences. And if you look at history, there are many people who have mocked God, who have been angry at God and mocked Him, who have just mocked Him because they don't believe He exists. And many of those people have died prematurely. Too many to be just a pure coincidence. So this is what Solomon is getting at. One, there is falsehood everywhere. There is vanity in the world. There is vanity without God, but there also can be vanity and falsehood within the place of worship if people are not sincere, are not reverent to at least some degree, are not with the right attitude. If people are too busy and make false dreams, or can't get themselves settled, they may make false accusations and false claims. And this is what he says: in the multitude of dreams and too many words, there is also vanity. The main thing is to be sincere, to be honest, to be truthful, and to do it heartfeltly when you worship, pray, and attend church. The main thing is to fear God. All else is meaningless, and in Solomon's words, vanity. So next time we'll go on to the second part of chapter 5. That's enough for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.